The colt stood at the far end of the auction yard with his ribs showing faintly through his dull coat, his legs thin and shaky like he could barely hold his own weight. Folks passing by hardly spared him a glance, and those who did mostly shook their heads. Some laughed under their breath, saying he wouldn't make it through the next cold night. Others whispered that whoever ended up with him was throwing money into the dirt. The sun baked the ground, and dust curled around the colt's hooves as he tried to stand a little taller, but even that small effort made him wobble. Still, there was something in his eyes that didn't match the rest of him. A quiet spark sat there, faint but stubborn, like he knew something no one else did. The rest of the auction yard was loud with shouting, bargaining, and boots scraping along the planks. Stronger horses were being pulled forward one after another, each greeted with eager bidders and proud owners. Colts with firm muscles, shiny coats, and clean strides fetched high prices. People gathered around the best ones, pointing out their bloodlines, their potential, and the money they could bring in. But no one looked twice at the little colt left near the back. He stood nearly hidden behind a taller mare, and if someone hadn't moved her aside, he might have gone unnoticed altogether. The colt's owner at the time, an older hand with tired eyes, claimed he had done all he could. He said the colt had been born during a rough season, too weak to run with the others, too small to be chosen for anything worthwhile. Even as he spoke, the man didn't sound cruel. He just sounded worn down, like he had seen too many hard years in a row. He patted the colt once, almost like an apology, then walked off to speak to another buyer. The colt watched him go with a soft breath, but he didn't buckle or drop his head. He simply waited, silent as the world moved around him. While the busy crowd focused on the stronger horses, one man stood quietly by the fence, watching the weak colt from a distance. He wasn't dressed like a wealthy buyer. His shirt had seen many seasons of sun, and his boots had more patches than smooth leather. But he had a way of studying the colt that didn't come from pity. He looked past the thin frame and the shaky legs as if searching for something deeper. Some folks nearby noticed him staring and started nudging each other. They joked that if he wanted to waste money on a hopeless colt, he might as well throw his coins in a well. Yet the man didn't move. He kept watching, and the colt seemed to notice him too. For a moment their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. The little colt lifted his head just a bit higher. It wasn't much, but enough to make the man step closer, resting his hands on the fence rail. He whispered something that the wind carried away, and the colt flicked his ears as if he understood. The auctioneer eventually called out for the next item, his voice booming through the dust-filled air. When he reached the colt, some folks chuckled openly. The auctioneer even hesitated, trying to pull out something encouraging to say. But the murmurs in the crowd made it clear no one expected anything more from the colt than a few low bids from children or someone looking for a pasture ornament. The man by the fence took a breath and straightened. A few people turned toward him, already shaking their heads. The bidding started low, far lower than any other horse that day. A couple of boys shouted playful bids just to hear the auctioneer call their numbers. A few half-hearted offers followed, most out of boredom more than true interest. The man waited, saying nothing while the crowd grew restless. The colt shifted nervously, his thin legs trembling again. The sun glared off the dust and the wooden rails, making the whole yard shimmer slightly. The auctioneer was about to close the sale when the man finally raised his hand. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to silence the last bit of laughter. He placed a simple bid, not high but firm. Most folks blinked, thinking they heard wrong. But the auctioneer nodded and repeated the number clearly. The boys who had been shouting bids earlier fell quiet. A few men exchanged glances as if wondering what the stranger saw in such a weak animal. The bidding went silent, and after a long pause, the auctioneer brought the hammer down. The colt was sold. A ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd. Someone muttered that the man must have lost his senses. Others shrugged, saying it wasn't their coins being wasted. The man walked over and approached the colt slowly, showing patience instead of force. The colt lowered his head, uncertain but calm. The man lifted a gentle hand, letting the colt sniff him first before touching him. The touch was light, steady, and different from the hurried hands of the auction yard. The colt breathed in, holding still, then leaned slightly into the contact. It was small, but the man smiled like he had been waiting for that moment. As the man led the colt away, voices rose behind him, filled with jokes, confusion, and disbelief. Some folks claimed the colt wouldn't survive the week. Others snorted that the man would regret his decision by morning. The man didn't turn around, not once. He kept moving forward with the colt walking at his side. With each step, the little colt seemed to find a bit more balance. His legs still shook, but he stayed close, trusting the steady presence beside him. The road leading away from the auction yard stretched long and quiet. A faint wind blew across the open land, carrying away the distant laughter and chatter. The colt stumbled once, but the man stopped and waited, giving him time to steady himself. They moved again, slow but sure. A wagon rolled past at one point, and the driver stared at the pair with raised brows. But the man nodded politely and continued on his path. As the sun dropped lower, the land turned gold and warm. The colt's thin coat caught the light in a way that gave him a soft glow, almost hiding his weakness. The man glanced down at him more than once, noticing every movement, every tremble, every breath. Something about the colt reminded him of stories he had heard growing up, tales of horses that rose from nothing and changed the lives of those who believed in them. He didn't know yet if the colt could become one of those stories, but he felt the pull of possibility. By the time they reached the man's small homestead, the sky had begun to deepen. The colt looked around with quiet curiosity, taking in the fenced pasture, the worn barn, and the soft light glowing from the cabin window. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, as if testing whether this new place was safe. The man opened the small barn door and guided the colt inside. The scent of hay and old wood filled the air. He set fresh water and a small pile of feed nearby. The colt eyed it carefully, then leaned forward to take his first bite. The man leaned on the doorway, watching with a thoughtful expression. Outside, the wind shifted in a way that made the man look back toward the distant auction yard. Something about the day lingered with him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He didn't know what others had planned for their strong horses, or what stories would unfold for them. But he had a strange sense that the small, weak colt in his barn carried something different, something hidden that no one else had seen. He didn't know yet that this quiet, trembling animal would change his life more than any horse he had ever owned. And he didn't know that the first sign of that change would come sooner than he expected. The night after bringing the colt home was long and restless for the man. He lay awake listening to the creaks in the old cabin and the low sighs of wind moving across the pasture. Every few minutes he found his thoughts drifting back to the barn, wondering if the colt had settled or if he needed help. He wasn't usually this concerned about a new animal, but something about the colt made him uneasy in a way he couldn't fully understand. Not fear, but a strange pull, like the colt carried a story he wasn't ready to tell. When morning light finally crept across the floorboards, the man got up before the sun was fully awake and stepped outside into the cool air. The barn was quiet when he came in, but the colt lifted his head right away. His thin body looked even smaller in the early light, yet his eyes were alert. He had eaten some of the feed, though not much. The man knelt beside him and spoke softly, letting the colt hear the calm rhythm of his voice. The colt's ears twitched, and after a moment he took a few steps toward him. They were shaky steps, but steps all the same. The man felt a small relief settle in his chest. It wasn't much progress, but it was something. As days passed, he learned more about the colt's behavior. He noticed the colt was quick to listen, quicker than most weak animals he had raised before. Even when he lacked the strength to run, he paid attention to every sound and movement. When birds rustled outside the barn door or a wagon passed along the distant road, the colt perked up instantly. He wasn't scared. He was curious. The man found that unusual for a colt that had likely been overlooked, possibly mistreated or ignored during its early months. Curiosity usually came from confidence, and confidence usually came from strength. But this colt seemed to have something deeper, something not tied to muscles or good breeding. The man spent hours every day working with him, not pushing hard but teaching him small things. How to follow a lead rope, how to take calm steps without stumbling, how to stand steady when wind blew through the barn cracks. Each day the colt grew a little braver. His coat began to shine a bit more, though it still wasn't as healthy as it should have been. His legs stayed thin, but they didn't shake as often. His appetite improved. And little by little, the man felt something strange building between them, something beyond the usual connection between a horse and its owner. Still, he couldn't ignore the whispers from the auction yard that drifted back to him through old friends. Folks said he'd wasted his money. Some laughed about it. Others wondered why he hadn't picked a stronger horse if he had wanted to raise something valuable, but he brushed off their comments. He didn't bring the colt home to prove anything. He had acted on instinct. And that instinct was the same thing telling him now that the colt had more in him than anyone realized. The man just didn't know what that more meant yet. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after he brought the colt home, a wandering trader stopped by. He had heard rumors about the colt and wanted to see him himself. He walked around the barn with a sharp eye and asked all kinds of questions about the colt's health, his behavior, and his potential. The man answered plainly, not trying to make the colt sound better than he was. Even so, the trader seemed strangely interested. When the man turned to check on the colt, he noticed how the animal watched the trader with focused attention, not fear. Not confusion, something sharper. Almost like he was trying to read the trader's intentions. The trader reached out to touch him, but the colt stepped back, lifting his head high with surprising steadiness. The man had never seen him move like that. The trader narrowed his eyes, as if that reaction told him something important. Without another word, he stepped back and left sooner than expected, leaving the man with a nagging thought he couldn't shake. As the colt continued to grow stronger, small things kept happening that made the man wonder if there was more history behind him. The colt reacted differently to certain sounds and scents. He refused to approach old leather straps the trader had brought, yet he walked right up to unfamiliar objects the man placed in the barn. He startled easily at loud voices but stood calm during storms. He seemed to know the layout of the yard even in the dark, walking with surprising accuracy despite the shadows. And there were moments when the colt would stand at the edge of the fence, staring off into the distance, ears lifted as if listening to something far away. One night, the man stepped outside and found the colt awake, standing in the moonlight with his head turned toward the hills. The man followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. No riders, no lights, no movement, just the pale hills resting quietly. Still, the colt stayed alert, tail lifted slightly. When the man called his name gently, the colt lowered his head and returned to the barn. But the way he moved, slow and deliberate, made the man wonder again. He tried to ignore the growing suspicion that the colt had experienced something before the auction. Something that had shaped him in ways the man didn't yet understand. But every day brought a new detail. One morning, he found the colt pushing open the barn door by nudging a loose board. Another day, he watched him figure out how to untie a rope not using his teeth and chin, something even trained horses struggled with. These weren't acts of chance. These were acts of intention. Weeks passed, and the colt began to develop strength in his stride. Not enough to run freely, but enough to walk the pasture without stumbling. The man followed him one morning as the colt wandered to the far end of the fence. He paused near the old oak tree that stood like a quiet guardian over the property. The colt stood there longer than usual, staring at the trunk with its rough bark and deep grooves. The man stepped closer, and only then did he see faint marks on the tree. Scratches, old, but not natural. Someone had made them long ago. He crouched down and brushed his hand over the marks. The colt lowered his head beside him and breathed out softly. It almost felt like the colt recognized the marks, like they were part of some lost memory. The man felt a chill crawl up his spine even though the sun was warm. He didn't know who had made the markings or why, but the colt's steady gaze made it clear this wasn't the first time he had seen them. The man walked back toward the barn, his mind swirling with questions that didn't have answers. Who had owned the colt before the older man at the auction? There had to be a story hidden behind those ribs and those wide eyes. Something more than a weak birth and a rough season. Something that explained why a colt so fragile carried a presence that didn't match his body. As days turned into another week, the man tried to study the colt's reactions to different things in the yard. He brought out old tools, blankets, bags, and saddles from storage. Some the colt ignored completely. others made him perk up instantly. A few even made him step back with tense muscles. The man didn't push him, he simply observed. And the more he observed, the clearer it became that the colt had lived a life far different from the story the auction yard had offered. Late one evening, as shadows stretched across the land, the man stood by the pasture fence watching the colt graze slowly. He thought about the laughter from the auction crowd, the trader's sharp questions, and the strange marks on the oak tree. He wondered if he had stepped into something bigger than a simple purchase. The colt lifted his head for a moment, the fading sunlight catching his eyes with a depth that made the man stop breathing for a heartbeat. He didn't know it yet, but the truth behind those eyes was something that would soon reach out and change far more than just one man's life. And somewhere out in the distance, beyond the hills, someone else had started looking for the colt again. The night after the fair felt unusually long for the rancher. He sat by the dim lantern in his small cabin, turning the worn hat in his hands while thoughts of the colt kept circling in his mind. He could not forget the way people had laughed, or how the small horse had looked at him with something close to trust. The rancher had never been the type to get swept up in ideas of fate, yet something about buying that colt felt like it would change more than his daily routine. It felt like a step into something bigger, something he could not fully explain but felt deep in his chest. The colt stayed quiet in the small stable behind the cabin, moving from one corner to the other, pausing sometimes as if listening to distant sounds. The rancher checked on him often through the night, worried that he might fall sick or hurt himself. He brought water, laid fresh straw, and even spoke to the little horse without expecting any answer. The colt would lift his head and blink slowly, and the rancher felt a strange pull toward the creature. It was not pity, it was not pride. It was something close to responsibility, mixed with a feeling he had not felt in years. By sunrise, a soft golden light spread across the open land, giving the ranch a peaceful look that did not match the unease growing inside him. The cattle needed tending, fences had to be checked, and the usual chores waited as they did every morning. Still, he found himself walking toward the stable first. The colt stood in the corner, but this time he looked more alert. When the rancher stepped inside, the colt shifted his weight and raised his head with an energy the rancher had not seen the day before. He smiled a little. Maybe there was more strength in the colt than anyone at the auction realized. Maybe the tired legs and thin frame were not signs of weakness after all. He fed the colt gently, noticing how the little horse's appetite seemed to grow with each passing hour. As he brushed the rough coat, he found fresh scars and old marks, the kind that told stories of long travel and poor care. The rancher felt anger rise inside him, but he pushed it back. What mattered was what came next. The days that followed were not easy. The colt struggled to stand strong for long. His legs sometimes shook, and once he even slipped, stirring fear in the rancher's heart. People in town had already heard that he bought the runt. Whenever he rode in to buy supplies, a few men would smirk or shake their heads. Some even told him straight that he had thrown away good money. The rancher kept his jaw tight and stayed quiet. He had no reason yet to argue, but something inside him refused to believe he had made a mistake. He spent long hours working with the colt, not training in the usual sense, but simply helping him build strength. He walked him slowly around the open yard, stopping often to let him rest. He brought warm feed, cleaned his stall carefully, and kept a close eye on the smallest changes in his behavior. Day after day, the colt started standing taller. His steps grew more sure. The rancher noticed how the colt watched everything, how his ears turned toward the smallest noise. There was alertness in him, a spark that only needed time to grow. One afternoon, the rancher decided to let the colt try a short run in the open field. He opened the gate and stepped aside. For a moment, the colt hesitated, unsure of the unfamiliar space. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he leapt forward. His legs stretched, his stride grew longer, and the rancher could swear the colt looked almost like a different horse. Still thin and small, yes, but the way he moved carried something sharp, something promising. The rancher felt his breath catch. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The colt slowed down after a while, panting but alert. He returned to the rancher with a calmness that surprised even him. The rancher reached out and touched him gently, feeling warmth under his hand. There was still plenty of work ahead, but a path had begun to form. The rancher knew it, even if he had no idea where it would lead. Yet beyond the ranch, beyond the quiet fields and fences, something else was brewing. The region had always had a mix of ranchers, traders, and a few ambitious men who wanted more land than they deserved. Lately, talk had been spreading about land prices rising, about outsiders buying property without caring who lived there or how that land had been cared for. Rumors drifted into town that one powerful buyer was looking at every ranch around, planning to buy them out or push the owners off. No one knew exactly who he was, but people whispered about him with caution. The rancher had heard these things lightly, not thinking they would reach his doors. His ranch was small, tucked away from the main roads, and he had little interest in large deals or noisy business. But trouble had a way of traveling farther than expected. Several days after the colt's first run, a stranger rode up to the ranch. He carried himself with a confidence that felt too heavy for someone visiting a humble place. The rancher stepped outside, wiping dust from his hands. The man introduced himself plainly and asked several questions about the land, the water source, the size of the fields. His tone stayed polite, but there was something sharp behind every word, something that made the rancher uneasy. When the stranger left, the rancher watched him ride away, feeling a cold worry settle on his shoulders. He had land that others might want. He had a colt that people underestimated. He had a life that could be shaken if he was not cautious. Despite the new tension, the rancher kept working with the colt. Days became weeks. The colt's muscles formed slowly but steadily. He ran stronger, turned faster, and reacted quicker to the rancher's signals. The rancher saw growth not just in strength but in spirit. There was determination in the colt, a will sharpened by his rough past. Still, the rancher could not ignore the signs around him. A neighbor mentioned that the same stranger had visited their place. Another man in town talked about selling out because the price offered was too high to turn down. Some called it luck. Some called it a threat. But everyone agreed that something was changing around them. One evening, the rancher was tending to the colt when he noticed movement near the fence line. A shadow passed, quiet and slow. He stepped outside with caution, watching carefully. The figure disappeared before he could get a clear look. He told himself it might be an animal, but the uneasy feeling in his chest said otherwise. Later that night he sat by the lantern again, thinking of the colt, the land, and the growing pressure. He wondered if he should be preparing for something bigger than he expected. The colt neighed softly from the stable, a comforting sound in the silence. The rancher leaned back in his chair and exhaled. Whatever was coming, he would face it, but he needed to be ready. And so, as days passed and the mystery deepened, the rancher found himself caught between hope for the colt and fear of the unseen forces closing in. He knew the colt had a future that no one else could see yet. He also knew that trouble was inching closer. What he didn't know was how soon that trouble would reach his doorstep or what it would demand of him when it arrived. The wind carried a strange stillness that hinted at the challenges ahead, and the rancher could feel change creeping toward him, step by step, waiting to reveal itself when he least expected it. The days that followed carried a strange heaviness across the ranch, as if the land itself sensed something stirring beneath the quiet surface. The rancher woke early each morning, but the peace he once felt at sunrise no longer settled in his chest. Instead, he scanned the open fields with sharp eyes, checking the fence lines more often than necessary. The colt, now stronger and more sure of himself, noticed the change in his owner's behavior. He lifted his head with alert ears whenever the rancher paused to listen or turned suddenly toward a sound. It was as though both man and horse were waiting for something they could not yet name. The strange visitor who had come to the ranch had not returned, but his presence lingered. In town, people whispered more openly now. A few ranches had already been sold. One family packed their wagon and left hurriedly, refusing to share the true reason behind their decision. Another man, who rarely got nervous about anything, admitted that someone had been riding near his land late at night. No one knew if it was connected, but fear spreads easily when it has room to grow. The rancher kept his concerns mostly to himself. He did not want to alarm anyone, especially not the few neighbors who counted on him for steady advice. Still, every passing day etched a deeper worry into his mind. He had no intention of selling his land. This ranch held memories he guarded closely, memories he did not share with anyone. Letting go of it would mean losing a part of himself, and he was not ready for that. Not now, not ever. He focused instead on the colt, pouring his energy into the steady training that had already transformed the once weak creature. The colt now carried a proud posture, his muscles stronger, his coat smoother, his movements sharp and full of life. Watching him run gave the rancher a rare moment of hope. The little horse's progress reminded him that strength sometimes rises from the most unlikely places. But hope alone could not erase the growing tension around him. One morning, while leading the colt toward the training field, the rancher noticed fresh tracks near the far edge of his property. They were not the marks of cattle or wild animals. These tracks were from a horse and not one he recognized. The ground was still damp from a light shower the night before, which made the tracks easy to see. Someone had been there not long ago. He knelt by the marks, running his fingers through the dirt. The earth felt freshly turned. The tracks led toward a cluster of trees before fading into the shadows. A cold prickle ran down the rancher's spine. Whoever had come near his ranch had not intended to be found. That evening he kept a lantern burning longer than usual. The colt shifted in his stall, uneasy from the rancher's tension. The man placed a steady hand on the colt's neck, letting the warmth ease the tightness in his chest. The connection between them had grown in ways he could not fully explain. The colt had become more than an animal he had rescued. He had become a source of strength, a reason to push back against the fear creeping toward the ranch. But fear had a strange way of finding cracks. 2 nights later, the rancher was woken by a distant thud. The cabin walls were thick enough to block most sounds, yet this one made him sit up instantly. He grabbed his coat, stepped outside quietly, and scanned the darkness. The moon was thin, casting faint silver light across the open land. The wind carried a chill that did nothing to settle his nerves. He moved toward the stable, guided by instinct more than thought. As he reached the door, he heard the colt's restless snort. The horse was pacing inside, hooves shifting nervously on the ground. The rancher opened the stall and checked him carefully. The colt was unharmed, but alert. His ears turned toward the back of the property again and again. The rancher stepped outside and walked along the fence line, keeping close to the shadows. The thud came again, this time softer, almost like something striking wood. He followed the sound cautiously. When he reached the far corner of the fence, he saw it. One of the posts had been tampered with. The top had been cracked, not by accident but by force. Someone was testing the boundaries. He tightened the fencing as best he could and returned to the cabin with a heavy heart. Whatever was happening was no longer simple rumors. Someone had taken an interest in his ranch and they were getting bolder. The next days passed with an unnatural tension. Every sound made the rancher pause. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The townsfolk continued talking about the mysterious buyer, the one who had been making offers no one expected. Some people claimed he had hired men to scare those who refused to sell. Others thought it was just gossip. But the rancher had seen enough to know it was not just talk now. He strengthened his fence. He watched the trails more closely. He kept the colt near him whenever possible, as if the presence of the horse offered some form of unseen protection. The colt sensed the tension and grew more watchful himself. Sometimes, when the rancher turned away, he saw the young horse staring out toward the hills, ears pointed as if he could hear something far away. One afternoon, while they were in the training field, the rancher noticed movement on the ridge above his property. A man on horseback, distant enough to be unclear but not distant enough to ignore. The rider paused at the top, looking down at the ranch for a long time before turning away. The rancher felt a spark of anger replace his fear. He was tired of being watched, tired of waiting for something to happen, and tired of feeling like he had no control over the danger closing in. But he knew better than to rush into a confrontation without understanding who or what he was facing. He continued training the colt with even more focus. The young horse grew faster, stronger, and surprisingly sharp in his reactions. He moved almost like he knew his owner needed him to be ready for something. Their bond deepened, shaped by shared tension and long hours spent side by side. The rancher began to see the colt not just as a creature with potential, but as a partner in whatever was coming. The turning point came on a day that started quiet, almost peaceful. The rancher was tending to the cattle when he spotted a wagon pulling up near the entrance of his property. The man who stepped down from it was the same stranger who had visited weeks earlier. His expression was calm, but his smile did not reach his eyes. He walked toward the rancher with slow, deliberate steps. His voice stayed polite, but every word carried pressure. He spoke about land prices, about opportunity, about how the rancher could secure a future without worry if he sold now. He presented it all like a favor, as if he were offering a gift instead of a threat. The rancher listened without offering much in return. He kept his face steady, refusing to show the unease twisting inside him. When he finally spoke, he said clearly that he was not interested in selling. The stranger's smile faded just a little. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. His words shifted from friendly to cold. He hinted at consequences. He hinted at how others had already agreed. He hinted that this ranch would not be left alone if the rancher refused, but the rancher held firm. After a long moment of silence, the stranger gave a nod that felt more like a warning. He turned, climbed onto the wagon, and left without another word. The rancher stood still long after the wagon disappeared from sight. His hands were clenched. His chest felt tight. He knew that the man's visit had shifted everything. The offer was no longer just talk. The threat was no longer hidden. It was standing right at his doorstep. That night, the rancher walked out to the field where the colt stood, grazing quietly. He placed a hand on the horse's neck and felt the steady breath beneath his fingers. The colt lifted his head and looked at him with calm, trusting eyes. For the first time in weeks, the rancher allowed himself to breathe a little deeper, but the moment was brief. The wind shifted, carrying a faint noise from the distance. It was hard to tell what it was at first, but as it grew clearer, the rancher understood. Horses, more than one, moving in his direction. The rancher turned toward the sound, heart pounding. The colt stepped closer as if sensing that something dangerous was about to unfold. And just as the noise grew louder, just as shadows began moving across the distant ridge, the rancher realized that whatever was coming next would test everything he had left. He braced himself, unsure of what he would face but certain of one thing. The calm before the storm had ended. The rancher stood still in the dim light, every part of him alert as the sound of hooves moved closer through the dark. It was impossible to tell how many riders approached, but the steady rhythm of the hooves made it clear that they were not drifting by accident. The colt pressed his shoulder to the rancher as if trying to steady him. For a moment the man felt the familiar warmth of courage rise in his chest. He had spent so long feeling hunted, pushed, and cornered, yet now, facing what felt like the final moment, he realized he was not alone. The figures appeared along the ridge, faint shadows at first, then gradually becoming clearer as they rode downhill. Lantern lights swung from one of the saddles, casting long streaks across the open ground. But something unexpected happened as they drew nearer. The rancher noticed they moved in an uneven pattern, not like a group planning to rush him. They were scattered, tired-looking riders. And when one called out his name, his breath caught in surprise. It was a neighbor, one of the last who had not sold his land. When the group reached the fence line, the rancher saw relief on their faces, not aggression. They were carrying tools, ropes, and one man held a torn piece of fencing. They explained that someone had been cutting through the boundary between their lands, too. They had come because they believed the rancher was the next target for intimidation. They had seen the same stranger near their property earlier that evening. The rancher felt the heavy fear in his chest lift little by little. For the first time in weeks, he realized he was not facing this trouble on his own. He invited them inside, and they spent hours around his small kitchen table talking through everything that had happened. The threats, the broken fences, the late-night riders, and the fear that had spread quietly across the valley. The rancher told them about the visit from the man who wanted him to sell. The neighbors shared similar stories. It became clear that the stranger had been trying to buy out nearly every ranch in the area, and when people refused to sell, he sent men to pressure them. But the rancher's refusal had clearly frustrated him more than others. He had expected the man to give in quickly, especially knowing the ranch held sentimental value. As they talked, The colt wandered near the open window, listening as if he understood the weight of every word. His steady breathing brought a strange calm into the room. One neighbor noticed the colt and let out a soft whistle, saying he had heard rumors about the weak little horse the rancher bought at the auction. He chuckled lightly when he saw how the colt had grown, saying the folks in town would be shocked to see him now. The rancher smiled for the first time in days. He said he always knew the colt had something special in him, even when others laughed. The animal had proven himself again and again, not with strength alone, but with an unusual awareness that seemed to rise whenever danger came near. That sense of loyalty had become a quiet anchor for the rancher. As dawn approached, the neighbors made a plan. They would not allow the stranger or his hired men to continue threatening anyone. Together they would repair the fences, take shifts watching the ridges, and ride into town the next morning to report what they had seen. The rancher felt a deep gratitude he could not voice. He had spent so much time isolated in his fear that he had forgotten how strong people could be when they stood together. When the neighbors left, the rancher walked outside with the colt at his side. The early light stretched across the hills, revealing the soft colors of morning. The danger had not disappeared, but something had shifted. He no longer felt hunted. He felt prepared. Later that day, the rancher, along with several neighbors, went to town. They spoke with the sheriff and shared every detail they knew. The sheriff had already collected a few complaints from others and admitted he suspected something far larger was happening than a simple land deal. Hearing the full story gave him enough reason to take action. Word spread quickly around town about the stranger's tactics. People who had been scared to talk stepped forward, sharing stories of letters, late-night visits, or sudden pressure to sell their properties. The community pulled together in a way the rancher had not seen in years. The sheriff gathered a group to ride out and locate the stranger's camp. When they found it, the men who had been cutting fences and intimidating ranchers scattered. The stranger was taken into custody without a fight. His plans to buy out the valley had depended on people being scared and silent, and once the truth came out, his influence dissolved completely. The rancher returned home with a sense of peace he had not felt in what seemed like a long time. It was strange how quickly the land felt different without the weight of fear pressing on it. The winds seemed gentler, the sky clearer, the quiet peaceful again rather than tense. The colt greeted him the moment he stepped into the yard, nudging his arm like he always did. The rancher laughed softly and rested his hand on the horse's neck. He whispered a quiet thanks, not only for the courage the colt seemed to give him, but for the journey he had taken with this unexpected companion. Some weeks later, a big event took place in town, a local race that had always drawn a crowd. People talked excitedly about the upcoming competition, wondering which ranch would bring the strongest horse. The rancher stood near the corral, watching the riders prepare, when a group of folks gathered around him. They asked if he planned to bring the colt into the race. At first, he hesitated. He remembered how the colt had looked on the day of the auction, shaking and weak, laughed at by nearly everyone. Back then, no one had imagined the horse could grow into anything more than a burden. But now, the colt stood tall, lean, and confident. The rancher realized the horse had earned his place among the best. More importantly, the colt had earned the chance to show the world what quiet perseverance looked like. When the race began, the rancher felt his heart pounding. The colt moved with a grace he had developed over months of training, his strides long and steady, his focus sharp. The cheers from the crowd grew louder with every lap. People who had once laughed at him now stared in disbelief at the power in his movements. In the final stretch, the colt surged forward with a burst of speed that seemed to rise from something deep within him. The rancher leaned close, whispering encouragement, feeling the horse respond with every part of his spirit. They crossed the finish line with the crowd erupting in excitement. The colt had won. People rushed toward the rancher, clapping him on the back, shaking his hand, praising the incredible turnaround of the once weak colt who had stunned everyone. The rancher felt pride swell in his chest, not because of the attention, but because he knew the truth. The colt had not become great overnight. He had become great through steady care, patience, and a bond built in the quiet moments no one else saw. In the days that followed, buyers approached the rancher with offers for the horse, some so high they seemed unreal. They spoke about breeding potential, about markets, about wealth. But the rancher shook his head every time. The colt was not for sale. He had already brought the rancher the kind of richness that could not be counted in money. The colt had given him strength during his darkest weeks, loyalty when fear tried to take root, and hope at a time when he felt alone. The rancher would never trade that for anything. The valley slowly returned to its usual rhythm. People rebuilt, repaired, and began to live without the cloud of threats hanging over them. When someone mentioned the stranger who had tried to take their lands, folks shook their heads and said the valley was too strong to be bought. The rancher spent his evenings standing near the fields, watching the sun dip behind the hills. The colt grazed nearby, lifting his head every so often as if checking on him. The quiet felt peaceful again, the land steady beneath his boots. He thought about how everything had started with a weak little colt at an auction, a horse everyone else dismissed. He thought about how laughter had turned to doubt, and doubt had turned to amazement. And he realized that sometimes the strongest stories rise from the most unlikely places. As the last light settled across the land, the rancher smiled softly, knowing he had found far more than he ever expected. The colt had made him rich, not with gold or land, but with trust, courage, and the reminder that even the smallest spark can light a path through the darkest trail. And with that truth held quietly in his heart, the story found its peaceful end.